I've been looking forward to doing this video for a while. I've been mulling it over in my head for a long time. I've done a lot of very satisfying reading to do it. The regulars of this channel know that I'm not a big fan of Big Five publishing because it doesn't seem to produce the type of books that I like to read. I'm a big fan of small presses. I'm always on the lookout for small presses to satisfy my literary tastes. Today, I'm going to talk about a small press, a small university press, that has published two really good basketball books that I enjoyed tremendously. And then, trying to figure out who was behind this development, I went down a rabbit hole that really led to a very, very pleasant surprise. So, stick around. I'm going to talk about all that. The press is Duke University Press, and the two books that I'm going to talk about were published in 2022. The first, Lost in the Game, a book about basketball, was written by a guy named Thomas Beller. Thomas Beller wrote a critically acclaimed novel, a critically acclaimed collection of short stories. He's also written collections of nonfiction, but most relevant to this video, he is a regular contributor to The New Yorker. He's basically their NBA writer. Lost in the Game juxtaposes many of the pieces that he wrote for that magazine between 2014 and 2021. He comments on guys like Latrell Sprewell. He's a long-suffering Knicks fan, also Zion Williamson. He lives most of the year in New Orleans, I think. He is, if I'm not mistaken, the director of the Tulane Creative Writing Program, so he's also a Pelicans fan. But he also writes about James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyle Irving, Nikola Jokic, many others, the Warriors. He juxtaposes all this with his passionate and, according to him, plotting Schoolyard play. He's a couple of years older than I am. I think he's 58 years old, and he's still out there. God bless him. It's almost as though he writes from the perspective of a very informed and implicated fan, like an insider. But not an insider in the sense that he knows all, or he is connected to all the movers and shakers and stars of the league. It's more that he defines himself by basketball, by his triumphs, his failures, his frustrations, almost as much as the players that he writes about. He's like this journeyman, self-imposed journeyman in schoolyard pickup games who challenges himself again and again against real talent despite his, according to him, limited talent, despite his age, despite his hang-ups. And by hang-ups I mean his unfinished business with the game, what he feels like he might have amounted to but never did. And because of this perspective, I think he's got a point of view that's different than anyone else writing about basketball. By far, in my opinion, the most valuable stuff in this book, the most unique, is when he's writing about his own experiences on the court. It's totally authentic. He is able to show how pickup games in the schoolyard really do forge, reveal, help us discover character. And best of all, and this is so important for any writer of memoir, he's not out to prove anything. He's not out to project any kind of persona. And therefore he writes very insightfully and honestly about himself. There's some great writers out there, man, who can't write about themselves. What makes this book stand out is his excellent, profound writing about himself. The second book is Big Game, Small World, a basketball adventure written by Alexander Wolff. It's the 20th anniversary edition, revised and expanded. I totally recommend this edition because he puts a coda on the end of each chapter, or at the end of each chapter, and each chapter is a story in itself. And the coda updates us on the events and on the characters in the piece. Alexander Wolff wrote for Sports Illustrated for 36 years, leaving in 2016. That means he began in 1980, ultimately becoming a senior writer. But I read that magazine religiously from 1980 to 1985, and then for another 4 years during the summers when I came home from college. And so I read all of those great writers. That was the magazine's halcyon days. I've read all those great writers many times, and Alexander Wolff has always been my favorite. I'll get in depth on why when I get in depth about Big Game, Small World. But first I want to say a few words about another book that Wolff published recently, precisely in 2021, with Atlantic Monthly Press, called Endpapers, a family story of books, war, escape, and home. I also reviewed that book on this channel. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video. It is a personal family saga going back 3 generations, a bit more. His grandfather was a seminal, perhaps the most important modern publisher in Germany. And he has Jewish blood, Alexander Wolff, but also family ties going back, or family ties, ancestors had family ties with the Nazi party. So that is the tension that makes that book such rich reading. But I think I prefer Big Game, Small World. It's got to be among the best, perhaps it is the best book ever written on the phenomenon of basketball, how it swept the world. After the game was invented by a Canadian Presbyterian minister, physician, and university professor, James Naismith, in 1892. Wolff did the reporting on this book between 1998 and 1999, basically the tail end of the Chicago Bulls' 6 championships, when Michael Jordan was, without a doubt, the most famous person in the world. In the course of this book, Wolff takes us to 16 different countries and 10 distinctively different places in the United States, showing us basketball ambiance, different basketball characters, different basketball styles, and showing us how Naismith's idea really took shape in each of these places and how it converted different people into its stars, its fanatics, and its standard bearers. And best of all, the sugar on top is that Alexander Wolff is a master of English prose. Crafting sentences and paragraphs, the malt juiced, the telling quote, these bursts of style that serve content. So many writers go overboard with style. He's always holding back, yet the book is permeated with his writing style. He's a writer's writer. To me, a writer's writer is someone who I read out loud to get a sense of fine, efficient, sonorous prose before I sit down and try my own hand at it. Right? I mean, every piece in this book is its own kind of gem. He leads us through with his bright, delightful, crackling style, and at the same time imparts this breadth and depth of information. He really does, in this book, show how basketball is a lot more than basketball and how it's changed the world. Okay, now for the pleasant, very pleasant surprise. So I finished these 2 wonderful books on basketball, and I wonder who's behind them. Who's behind this development? I look in the Duke University Press catalog, and there are a couple other basketball books there, but they're both about the Duke team. So I look in the acknowledgement section of both Beller's book and Alexander Wolff's book, and I find the name Dean Smith in both of them. Both of them give thanks to Dean Smith. Now, Dean Smith, most famously, is the coach of Duke's biggest rival in basketball, the North Carolina Tar Heels. So I'm thinking, is this some type of practical joke that Wolff and Beller teamed up on to play on Duke University Press? Turns out no. Turns out there's another Dean Smith, Dean Bartoli Smith. I go down the rabbit hole on him. Turns out he wrote a sports book himself in 2013 with Temple University Press called Never Easy, Never Pretty, a Fan of City Championship Season. It's a game-by-game account with context about Baltimore and personal anecdotes about the Baltimore Ravens' second Super Bowl season. They won a Super Bowl in 2013 and also 2001. So, Dean Bartoli Smith has experience as a sports writer. I go further down the rabbit hole, and I discover on Google this book that's been digitized by some library called American Boy, published in 2000 by a press called Washington Writers Publishing House. I start reading it, and I'm loving it. Loving it. I mean, you people have heard the praise I've just given to these two basketball books. Wonderful books. I swear to you. I liked American Boy more. Now, partly because it's my subject of choice, memoir, basically pure memoir, but also because it just lays out Dean Bartoli Smith's soul, man. In all its glory and defeat. You know, I ended up reading the book 3 times. I got to do that with poetry. I think we all got to do that with poetry. But you know, reading a book 3 times is not a chore. If every time you read it, there are these wonderful light bulb moments when the story just gains perspective and scope and richness. It's the opposite of a chore. And you know, it's only 44 poems. It's like 60 pages. So, you know, read 60 pages 3 times. I read this book faster than I read the other 2 books. It's about so much. It spans so much time. It starts with his childhood in Baltimore. It's about his parents' broken marriage. It's about his grandparents' broken marriage. He talks about personal memories of JFK's assassination, but then there's another experimental poem about JFK's assassination. There's also a poem written from the perspective, I swear, of a crab about Baltimore history. You'd think it'd be terrible. It's wonderful. There's another experimental poem about torture instruments that culminates in, I think, a visit to Auschwitz, or some stories he heard from Auschwitz. It gets into his years as a young adult, this doomed, wild love affair. The poem is called Eleonora. It's about her. Another poem about jazz, poems with this Southwest feel. And then, you know, he gets into what I think is his own broken marriage, these short poems in the book's final section about lost love, heartbreaking poems. And in the end, you know, he finds love again in Italy, and it ends with this great line, please scatter my ashes, crushed like red pepper on the Via dell'Amore. What a gorgeous last line. There's also a poem in the book which I could really relate to. I mean, you can see he's a sports fan in some of the poems. There's this poem called Old Timer, where he compares himself to this ball left, I mean, out in the bushes over the winter. It's waterlogged but can still crack wood. I mean, really, it's just wonderful stuff. You know, it's edifying and encouraging to read a book by an obscure writer that I think is bolder and riskier than 2 books written by consecrated writers. Just relentless, rigorous poetry, but also tremendously satisfying. You know, I'm also an obscure writer, you know? And you like to believe that maybe your book will somehow find the perfect reader. Well, you know what? Dean Bartoli Smith's book, American Boy, found me. I'm like the perfect reader for that book, man. And that's just a wonderful surprise. All right, I'm going to end this video on a note less filled with philosophical angst. I hope that Duke University Press does for basketball books what the University of Nebraska Press has done for baseball books, and what Hamilcar Publications has done for boxing books. Let's hope that Dean Bartoli Smith makes that happen. And let's hope that he continues writing. I see that he's written another book of poetry called Baltimore Suns, published by Stillhouse Press in 2021. I'm going to check that out. I'm definitely gonna check that out.